Greg Castillo. I was the guest curator, co-curator of the Hippie Modernism show, which I hope you have time to take a look around and see. You'll see actually many of the Emory Douglas posters that you're going to hear about a little bit about today. My job is really to introduce our moderator, Sean Burns. Sean is the director of the Office of Undergraduate Research and Scholarship at UC Berkeley. He received his PhD from the History of Consciousness Department at UC Santa Cruz. And his monograph, Archie Green, The Making of a Working Class Hero, explored Bay Area labor activism and was awarded the CLR James Book of the Year Award in 2012. Among other accomplishments, Sean has also been known to play a 1942 Martin 015 guitar in Professor Burns in the Lilac Fields, a musical project celebrating the people, ecology, and emancipatory spirit of the San Francisco Bay Area. Will you please welcome Sean Burns?
I just want to give extra props to Greg for being such a critical part of this very ambitious exhibit. In fact, the word on the streets is that it's the most ambitious exhibit in the history of the institution, is what I have heard. And speaking of the history of the institution, I've also heard that the founding director is here, Peter Seltz. So props to you. This afternoon, in part, is about continuities, and there's nothing more important in social continuity than multi-generational gatherings and friendships. So I look forward to meeting you, Peter, and Sherry too, who is in the crowd, who does so much for the museum, particularly about these sort of the extracurricular part of exhibits. The phones in our pockets, please do silence those if you haven't already as we move toward our panelists. So remember that. Here's what's going to happen this afternoon, a little bit of overview. I'm going to introduce the panelists now. Then after doing so, I'll say a few words to set the table, thematically, politically. Then one by one, they'll come up. And for about 15 minutes, the three of them will do each a presentation. And then we'll all come up after that, and we'll open it up for what I hope is a rich dialogue, and we should have a good 45 minutes for that. We have to be out of here by 3. That's basically the only hard rule today. So let me introduce the panelists, and maybe they'll just sort of wave, and you'll hear from them soon. Sorry, there's a bag here. Lisa Uddin will be speaking first. Lisa is an assistant professor in the Department of Art History and Visual Cultural Studies at Whitman College, where she teaches courses on U.S. art and urbanism, critical race, and ethnic studies. She's the author of several essays and reviews on the human-non-human interface in visual culture and the built environment, as well as the book Zoo Renewal, White Flight and the Animal Ghetto. That's University of Minnesota Press in 2015. And this book locates efforts to improve animal exhibits in the 60s and 70s within struggles over urban decay, suburban growth, and the post-war condition of American whiteness. And currently she is researching the visual and spatial practices of the Black Panther Party, Black Panther Oakland, for a tentatively titled book called Survival Modes, Blackness, Biopolitics, and California Modernism. So of course, we're going to hear from her today in relation to that project. This project considers the terms, textures, and futurity of Black life as it's interested and intersected with modernist discourses in California. So Lisa's going to speak first. Secondly, Anthony Raynsford is here. Anthony, welcome. Anthony's a historian of architecture and urban design and holds the position of associate professor in the Department of Art and Art History at San Jose State University down in the South Bay. He's also chair of that department. His presentation today is from a book in progress entitled Cities for an Open Society, and the presentation will explore Berkeley's People Park and its role in an extended geography of liberated countercultural spaces. Can't wait to hear that. And finally, welcome Bonnie Ora Sherk right here in the front. Bonnie is both New York City and San Francisco based, an artist, a planner, a landscape architect, and an educator whose creative practice connects people of all ages to landscapes, ecosystems, and opportunities for expression and learning in those spaces. And in 1974, when I was 1, she launched Crossroads Community, aka The Farm. 1974, a 7-acre urban agriculture and multi-arts community space that connected diverse land fragments and communities and incorporated a freeway interchange in San Francisco. We'll be hearing more about freeways, I take it. And Sherk's passionate commitment to place continues with a living library, a series of place-based, ecological, community-engaged transformation projects, systematically integrating hands-on learning programs that help unearth buried urban streams, turned asphalt public spaces into thriving educational eco-art gardens and nature walks that demonstrate our interconnection, biology, culture, technology. So really thankful that you three are here today to dialogue with us. And I just want to say a few things to set the table. How I appreciate the invite to moderate, and this is sort of what comes up with, for me, being handed this title. It goes without saying that the political urgency of the conditions within which the idea of liberated territories first emerged very much remains with us today, that political urgency. And the context that I'm thinking of are multiple, but I think are best described as decolonialism. It's our job to think across time and across geographies about the continuities and the changes in how empire states, capitalist privatization, and white supremacy oppress and territorialize in their systems. Our job is to think across different sites and different scales of liberation. And indeed, today's panelists will be addressing those different sites in those scales through the projects and the people and the events that they will be addressing and that continue to live and push those boundaries. So for me, the diverse countercultural histories that we're about to explore are most generatively understood within the legacy of decolonialism, because as revolutionaries from Frantz Fanon to Che to Bob Marley to Audre Lorde to Digger Free families to John Trudell, Karina Gould, all of these people, they have identified that territories that must be liberated are multiple and in relation to each other. They're in continuum, which is to say decolonialization of the land is linked with decolonialization of the mind, liberation of the land, liberation of consciousness, revitalization of the land, and revitalization and renewal of land is linked to revitalization of community, of spirit, of relations. So as we talk about Oakland, San Francisco, Berkeley, Alcatraz, as we talk about those spaces today, and when we think about gentrification, or when we talk about its antidote, urban development without displacement, I feel like we need to remember that we're also talking about, in an internationalist sense, Algeria, Cuba, Vietnam, Angola. I mean, that's where the term emerges from, okay, and makes its way into other countercultures. and we need to think about that relationship. What does it mean to have this kind of remembering that is multiracial and internationalist? What does that do for our notions of counterculture? What does it do for our notions of hippie? What does it do for our notions of modernism? So finally, I just want to bring into the room two struggles across time that are very much, that were with us in the 60s and 70s, whether you talk about the 1760s or the 1860s or the 1960s or now. And these struggles are indigenous struggles for liberated territory, the local Ohlone, the local water protectors. They have a vision for the contested waterfront at University and 4th Street right now. And that vision, I invite you to learn more about it, to get involved with it. And I invite the city to get ahead with a vision that truly honors that history and can create space for those continued communities to do ceremony and be valued in the way they should. And secondly, sanctuary, right? Sanctuary. Well, this is an ancient concept, Old Testament, etc., right? It's also a really important concept for the Underground Railroad. And the modern iteration of the term has a lot to do with this city we're standing in. In 1971, 10 churches in the Bay Area, and indeed the city of Berkeley itself, declared itself a sanctuary for U.S. soldiers who refused to ship out to Vietnam on the USS Coral Sea, an aircraft carrier that was right there in Alameda in the Bay, headed for Vietnam. That's 1971. You turn to the next decade, and that term sanctuary took on national and international recognition because of what churches and, again, municipalities like Berkeley did to create sanctuary for the refugees from Latin America and all those wars, many of which U.S.-backed, that drove those people to flee. So, I don't need to tell you all why sanctuary is such a vital conception and political act now. Let's just get into it. And again, thanks for being here on a beautiful Saturday, and let's have a politically urgent conversation. Lisa, come on up. All set.
Thanks, Sean. I bring a pen because it's always work in progress, right? I have some thanks to give as well, starting with Greg Castillo for assembling us and for the invitation and for hippie modernism as in the specificities of hippie modernism here at BAMPFA. It's exciting to be a part of it, so thank you for that. I also want to thank Valentina Rosa Kraus for some impeccable research assistance for this work that's in progress. To Sean Carson for organizing some of the logistics, and for new friends, hopefully, and interlocutors, Bonnie and Anthony. So thank you very much. And Sean, of course, for bringing us into this space and for putting at least two things on the table for us to start off with. Okay, so here we go. I'm going to try to make it conversational. This past January, I visited Oakland to take in some of the commemorative work underway for the 50th anniversary of the Black Panther Party. There's a button that I picked up. It's no secret that numerous exhibitions, lectures, and publications have vigorously, one could say urgently, reflected on the histories and legacies of the Panthers since their founding as a national organization in Oakland in October 1966. So just time for two notable examples of that commemoration. At Impact Hub Oakland, the show Survival Pending Revolution used rare documentary photographs, posters, and radical press graphics to reveal an organization that was well situated in cities around the country, but also blooming in the radical imaginaries of Algiers, Aboriginal Australia, Jerusalem, and Western Europe. A highlight for this event that I attended was former party member Erica Huggins and her guided tour of the show, and then the panel discussion that followed, which was a mix of seasoned and younger social justice workers. And at the Oakland Museum of California, the ambitious All Power to the People, Black Panthers at 50, explored the party through, amongst other forces, urban renewal policies, the drafting of the party's 10-point program, the contemporary art of Carrie Mae Weems and Hank Willis Thomas and others, and the apparatus of California law enforcement. So what struck me about these and other modes of public history and memory was their complication of site specificity and origin stories. They moved across different media, borders, temporalities, and discursive fields with really impressive agility and a willingness to unsettle Oakland as some kind of hallowed ground. It was hollowed in some ways, but also hallowed. This deterritorialized approach to Panther history, and perhaps countercultural history at large, is what I want to highlight and what I want to follow today, because I think it can actually help us understand something important about liberated territory in the purview of Black American life generally, if one can generalize, and US Black radicalism more pointedly. And that something is as follows. That liberated territory for the Panthers doesn't have to be understood as a project of making or securing territory as such. And I say this despite the party's early rhetoric of self-defense, which included, of course, its original name, the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, stock photos now that get circulated that become iconic of what the BPP stood for and how they operated, and that sort of iconography of black berets, firearms, raised fists, and so forth. The party, after all, or rather, in fact, liberated territory in the BPP's orbit can be thought of as a project of emancipating the Panthers and their community from the very idea and social history of territory. The party wasn't really shy, for example, to reject their immediate surroundings by characterizing them as Black concentration camps, as colonies, as the concrete inner city jungles of Babylon, that ancient biblical metropolis known for its rampant materialism and cruelty against Jews. So my somewhat counterintuitive reasoning draws from a couple of places. One is Catherine McKittrick and Clyde Wood's assertions that Black geographies can reconfigure normative conceptions and experiences of space, including the desire for and demarcation of our place. And I put that in quotes intentionally, just so that we can examine that a little bit more. For these authors, the formulation of our place is too often affected through the displacement of others, i.e. not the production and then the defending of territory itself. In other words, a Black sense of place is not conventionally territorial. McKittrick and Woods go on to argue that studying Black geographies in the form of overlapping diaspora spaces that were formed through various migrations, voluntary and of course non-voluntary, to say the least, brings into focus networks and relations of power, resistance, histories, and the everyday, rather than locations that are simply subjugated, perpetually ghettoized, or ungeographic. In other words, a Black sense of place can actually foil accounts that overemphasize spatial domination above all else. It's more complicated than that. But at the same time, resistance for Black people in the United States is marked by precarity. And I take my cues from that fact, from Saidiya Hartman's paradigmatic cultural history of opposition to American slavery in the 19th century. Hartman shows how Black insurgence is a more quotidian affair than normally recognized. It more often than not has unfolded as fleeting interruptions or kind of micro movements against systemic oppression, more than a decisive or legally enshrined emancipation from it. Smaller scales. So while assertions of Black liberation are real and powerful, they haven't proven to be transformative in the sense of actualizing the widespread economic and physical and social well-being of Black lives. So given these frameworks, I want us to think about the sense of urban place produced and experienced by the party, which we might call Black Panther Oakland, as an expansive and momentary zone of freedom that emerged within the material boundaries and social specificities of Blackness in the East Bay of the late 1960s, but also constituted a tactical flight from those boundaries and specificities. So this was a formation of freedom that, like the party commemorations a half century earlier, refused to stay still. And it was a formation of freedom that, like others in the Black American experience, was without any guarantees. Panthers around the Bay Area cultivated this provisional, dynamic zone of freedom through multiple practices, and we have an amazing documentary archive that attests to that. Patrolling the police was one of those practices, occupying public spaces through drills and rallies, boycotting businesses, and running survival programs to address the specific needs of a community under siege. It's a whole history that's been beautifully articulated by folks like Alondra Nelson and more recently Robin Spencer. But here I want to focus on instead the design and circulation of the party's newspaper, the Black Panther Black Community News Service, its original full title, as one of these freedom-forming practices. Running between 1967 and 1980, with 537 total published issues at 25 cents each, those are the stats, the tabloid-sized periodical was the Panther's weekly chronicle of the movement for Black power, its primary recruitment tool and a fairly important income source as well. Described by one party member at the height of its popularity as, quote, the flesh and blood, the sweat and tears of our people. I love how tangible and embodied that is. The paper detailed current strains of anti-Blackness, circa 1967 forward, continuities with earlier forms of structural racism, and connections with other decolonization struggles worldwide. It also advanced anti-establishment thinking that could germinate a nascent Black radical consciousness in Oakland, as well as Panther chapters in a slew of other cities in the US, New York, New Haven, Raleigh, Detroit, Chicago, LA, and so forth. Beginning with its second edition and under the art direction of the party's Minister of Culture, Emory Douglas, the Black Panther became exceptionally imaginative in its visual presentation, pitched towards a community, a Black community of, in Douglas's assessments, activists more than readers. Layouts and images were produced by Douglas himself, other Panther artists like Tarika Lewis and Gail Dixon, known then as Matilaba and Asali, respectively, as well as rank and file party members. It was a group effort, collective. Through their formal versatility, these visuals enacted the liberation they sought to describe. They enlarged the repertoire of Black respectability established by the civil rights movement and flagged just briefly here by Bill Hudson's iconic photo, which has its own fascinating history. But let me detail some of the versatility, the formal versatility of the Panther newspaper. In addition to audacious type, bright two-color printing, pages routinely foregrounded photography. Photography was huge. Sourced from mainstream news sources and the party's own photographers. And then they incorporated them into the designs as various as a bootlicker's gallery, a police lineup of persecuted Panthers, and this grayscaled, oversized image of a Che Guevara-esque QEP Newton, one of the party's co-founders, which was a photograph recycled from the newspaper's evolving masthead, which was a photograph recycled from an original image by Kenneth Green Sr., one of the party photographers. The paper also published hand-drawn illustrations, often with loose gestural lines, that conveyed both the immediacy and vulnerability of their cause. And other images were more defined, such as the rifle that repeatedly appeared in one of the paper's December 1970 issues, kind of like a refrain. Trained in commercial art, Douglas's protest aesthetic was particularly dexterous in its range of design elements. And art historian Collage nails it, and we can see it here as well. Explosive collages of photographic media, thick black line drawing, bold lettering, adhesive textures and patterns, all assembled and, in a sense, flattened through the printing process. These techniques worked well as front covers, particularly when they pushed up into the masthead, and they were amplified as the paper's back page posters, where Douglas's art was given sort of maximum room to mobilize the people. The range of what Douglas and his comrades depicted through these and interior pages of the paper was equally wide, from portraits of self-possessed Black freedom fighters to detailed psychic landscapes of poverty and incarceration, to glorifications of children and the elderly reminiscent of communist and Soviet Chinese propaganda. So it wasn't just a reproduction of the human figure. I think it's more complicated than that. And of course, a continuous imaging of Panther leadership as reproducible icons, martyrs, and kin. Consider one of those subjects as another example of a deterritorialized sense of Black place in Oakland, the figure of the pig. While the pig predates the party's iconography and was depicted by other Panther artists and allies, Douglas's version of the figure gave Black Oaklanders a uniquely vivid picture of freedom from state harm, be it the police or the president or American imperialism. Drawing on his year in a rural California juvenile detention facility caring for pigs, Douglas's cartoons flipped the script of Black non-humanization, gave readers images of what white threat looked like. It looked like a grotesque farm animal disguised as a human, and instructions on how to survive it. While these pigs can be understood as bracing fantasies of Black power, it's also worth noting that they helped readers fathom the magnitude of their subjugation, sometimes in very distinctly spatial terms. Here's one that's downstairs. In this frightening image, produced in the wake of the Apollo 11 mission, pigs take the form of both a rocket and US soldiers colonizing the moon through a renewed slave economy that removes Black people from Earth. The sky's alarmingly red, the moon's surface is severely pitted, the stench of anti-Blackness carries through flies buzzing around the porcine oppressors. It is a scathing rehearsal and critique of white supremacy, Cold War white supremacy, that rendered its space-age optimism as a dystopian near future. I find it helpful to think about the freedoms activated within and as Black Panther Oakland, not only through the design of the paper, but also through its modes of distribution. Douglas's back page posters, for instance, were frequently reprinted and wheat pasted around the urban built environment, which, according to Elton Fax's list in 1977, included walls, storefront windows, fences, doorways, telephone poles and booths, passing buses, alleyways, gas stations, barbershops, beauty parlors, laundromats, liquor stores, and the huts of the ghetto. I really love this list. I love this list. I wish I could map this list because it remaps the city as a vibrant, if impermanent, gallery of reconstituted Blackness. And images here kind of indicate some of those locations, including a photograph from a BPP exhibit space in Algiers during the Pan-African Cultural Festival. And the work traveled in other formats too. Greeting cards, buttons. At 139 copies sold per week during its peak, which is quite a conservative estimate, but I'll take it. The paper itself was an object of impressive circulation. Some historians have described this as a sort of a well-oiled machine of motivated labor and management. That might be the case, but I'm interested in stressing sort of the distribution as an integral part of this provisional and dynamic zone of freedom. Like its layouts and images, the weekly life cycle of the paper helped formulate a Black Panther Oakland that was unfixed in its dimensions and in its spirit. Once printed, the paper was transported to the central distribution spot in the Fillmore district of San Francisco, where it was packed into boxes for eventual air shipment, usually on United Airlines bulk rate discounts. And according to former party members and current archivist Billy X. Jennings, it was a weekly Wednesday night social event with every Panther in the Bay Area coming to help get the paper out. And students from all sorts of institutions, from Black student unions in Merritt and Laney College, San Francisco State University, students from UC Berkeley, SF City College, area high schools. You had to be 9, that was the minimum age to sell the paper. And also the paper sought to get itself into the hands of routine readers. There was a subscription drive beginning in the 1970s to foster readership through door-to-door subscription drives. Subscribe to survive was the slogan. And by signing up with the news service, readers would stay alive. That was the hope. That was the promise. That was the contract. By staying informed, by funding survival programs implemented for the party, and becoming participants in, quote, working out the best means and ways of solving problems of our people, of Black people and poor people. So as a testament to the power of these and other pragmatic, small-scale initiatives, I'll end with one historical note, compliments of the FBI's counterintelligence program. In August 1970, its San Diego field office proposed contaminating the newspaper's printing facility with scatol, a chemical powder known to duplicate the stench of feces. The aim was to render the building uninhabitable and stop the paper's publication. Similar proposals were actually carried out in other US cities with sprays of the chemical, as well as urine, directly onto the paper in an effort to make it unsellable. So these moves to materially defile the paper reinforce how liberating the periodical could be for those who produced, distributed, and consumed its pages across networks of Blackness in Oakland and well beyond, and how uncertain were the freedoms that emerged from it. So, last point, in continuing to assess the Black Panther Party as it bears on politics and cultures of resistance today, from the movement for Black lives to a reinvigorating left, let's remember that radical practices can unfold at different geographic scales, intensities, and durations, and that they do best, I think, when they unsettle received notions of territory as a necessary condition and goal for liberation.
Anthony, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sean, and thank you to Greg Castillo for organizing this and inviting me, and also to the Berkeley Museum of Art and for this incredible forum and exhibition. So I want to just say that this is a topic which I bumped into accidentally, and I have been sort of falling into ever since. And so I'm delighted to to talk about it. And it's interesting, sort of maybe in contrast to Lisa's presentation, I will be talking about very physical pieces of territory and how people fought over them. So in thinking about liberated territory in general, I wanted to investigate maybe the idea of liberation, right, and what it meant. And if we could project ourselves back to the era of People's Park, when people were talking about what it meant to liberate territory, I think you would have gotten very different answers depending who you asked on what day and what mood they were in. But I think there are three sort of senses that would have come through a lot of the conversations, and I just want to explore three of them without suggesting that these are the only senses or that people necessarily separated them all the time. But it's useful to think about them separately because they were really different in terms of their ambition, their scope, and the ideas. So the question, first of all, is liberated from what, right? What were they trying to liberate this territory from, right? And so the simplest or most obvious answer is it was just urban neglect, right? This is an empty piece of land. People were trying to beautify it, right? And plant some flowers where there was just a parking lot. And you heard a lot of these kinds of responses. The other was that it was being liberated not just from that, but from something more globally called the establishment, right? Which was all of the things like police and sidewalk, vagrancy, enforcement, and all of the ways in which space, urban space, is regulated and ruled also by things like leases and land titles, things like this. And then you could ask other people and they would say, no, it's more fundamental than that. People's Park is fundamentally about rejecting industrial Western civilization globally, worldwide. This is a worldwide revolution. So this is, and you can see this increasing ambition, right, from having a nice local park to worldwide revolution in these stages of what we're being liberated from. And then for whom, right? So if it's just urban neglect, maybe it's really just the people who live around the neighborhood who benefit, right? People who have to suffer from lack of parks, things like this. And that was certainly a part of the issue, right? The other is, of course, that Berkeley was a site of national, international immigration of the counterculture, of hippies. They were coming daily into Berkeley. They were often coming with no place to live. They were living on the streets. They were living on crash pads, right? Things like this. And so part of the idea of People's Park was actually to be a place for hippies, right? And I think that's an important layer, right? And what would their paradise be, right? That was kind of part of it too. And then there was a strong ecological component, this coming out of the New Left, right? We can think of a lot of strains of the New Left, right? The Black Panthers being one, radical ecology another. So for this strain of the New Left, it was liberating all species, human and non-human, to live in harmony. And this was one of the purposes then of People's Park. So I want to talk about then these three senses of liberation in turn. But I want to maybe just start because I don't want to assume that everyone here knows the whole history of People's Park. So I just want to give you the history of People's Park in 4 acts, very sort of summarized, quick version. So I think about Act 1, there was a campus expansion, part of a master plan in 1956. This is a plan from that. It was a whole book, right, that was produced on this master plan together with lots of glossy images. This is a period when the university was expanding. It had ambitions to be a sort of a model research university for the nation, right, part of the military-industrial complex. And there were many more students than they could accommodate. So this was part of the plan, was to actually build into the South Campus neighborhood. So you see these little, I need a laser pointer, but you see these little blocks on the left-hand side. Basically, a kind of archipelago. They were going to cut an archipelago of dormitories within the neighborhood. So leaving parts of the neighborhood intact, but then building into that neighborhood dormitories and then also recreation grounds. So it was approved. It was part of urban renewal in this period, urban renewal legislation, which helped propel this kind of activity. And then some of this was actually built, right? Not quite in that form, but you see them today, right? This is how they were built in the 1950s and 60s. And they filled up, and you can see they have a nice kind of modernist form, which fit in with that kind of what we might call its kind of technocratic culture of the period, but did not fit in to the culture of the late 60s, when these dormitories were despised, actually, by students and faculty alike. So the next, Act 2, would be the last stage in this urban renewal plan. And this was a stage in which the university had shifted from just wanting to expand. Actually, they didn't need more dormitories at this point. But what they wanted to do was to push out what they considered undesirables in the South Campus neighborhood. So undesirables were, in large part, the hippies, right, who were coming in. They saw them as sort of infecting the students, and metaphorically, right, through their ideas and their lifestyle. And they wanted to basically get rid of a lot of low-cost housing and replace it with nicely separated dormitories. But in fact, they didn't build anything, right? What they did was they tore down a whole series of houses. You can see, you still see it in the neighborhood, right? These beautiful shingle houses and Victorians. This block was about 2/3 of it demolished. And then what they left was basically just mud and foundations. And this was used as a parking lot. sort of informally. And of course the cars made the mud worse, and you can see little rivers started to form, and it was almost like it was turning back to the land, right, in this way. So that was a condition for several years, right, or at least maybe a year and several months before People's Park itself. So the event that sparked People's Park itself was an advertisement that was taken out in an underground newspaper called the Berkeley Bard, right? One of many underground papers in the country. This is the local paper. So this is the advertisement, Hear Ye, Hear Ye. It was signed by Robin's Hood commissioner, who was Stu Albert. You can see holding a gun there in that particular image. And it's and I won't go through the whole ad. It's a very interesting text, really. There's actually a lot in there. But the most famous line was probably, "We want the park to be a cultural, political, freak out and rap center for the Western world." Right? So it's very ambitious. But it basically just said, show up on this day with your shovels and your tools, whoever reads this ad, and we're going to do it. We're going to build a park right here. And so that's, in fact, what happened. And what was interesting about it is that many more people showed up than they expected, right? And they didn't know these people necessarily. They were there. And they all started working. And you can see, one image, they're actually pulling up asphalt, right? And then they built this sculpture with the letters "No" in it. And then this kept going on, right, for quite some time, right? And they actually built a playground. There were concerts. They handed out free food. It was actually quite used. So Act 4, right, what is called the Battle of People's Park, which happened very, very suddenly. But there was a series of negotiations between people supporting People's Park and the administration. Long story short, the regents and the chancellor refused to negotiate at a certain point and reclaimed the land for the university. So 4:45 a.m., the police fence off the land. And then at noon, right, so the same day, there's an enormous rally, right, that leads to kind of a street battle. One person killed, famously, on that day. And then by 9 o'clock that night, the governor calls out the National Guard, 3 battalions to come to Berkeley. And people who were there at the time describe it literally as war, right? They feel like they've seen these images of Vietnam on television, and now they feel like they're in it, right? And you can see some images there. Most famously, right, this is a little 5 days later, there is a rally that wants to leave the campus to march to People's Park. They're prevented by the troops with guns, right? And then a helicopter with tear gas actually gasses the entire campus. And protesters, faculty, students, staff, everybody. And so this is one of the sort of nightmare images of, the military-industrial state, right, descending on the campus. So what did people make of this, right? And there were all kinds of sort of reactions, obviously, to this. This is, by the way, international news at the time. And people in Europe were reading about People's Park. I mean, it was one of the major things. Almost, I want to say, almost at the level of the May '68 protests in Paris. So it was very, kind of interesting moment in time. So there were almost immediately the faculty at the College of Environmental Design were involved intimately in this process, right? Both as designers, but also as advocates, as were their students. And they tried to take a mediating role, many of them, between the administration and the People's Park occupiers, basically saying, let us mediate this for you, right? We'll manage it for you, and this will become a community-built, spontaneous park, and we'll also take notes, and we can even publish papers about this. So this was one idea. And Donald Appleyard was one of the major faculty involved in this. And his model, I think, was the idea that this would just be a neighborhood commons. So neighborhood commons was actually a term that was used, especially in Philadelphia. It had a whole sort of history, and actually goes back even earlier to Europe. But it had to do with land that was abandoned or neglected. So the title holder was not doing anything with the land. It was a vacant lot. And a lot of American cities had a lot of vacant lots in this period. And so one of the solutions was to simply, in some cases, the city would simply seize land that was tax delinquent, or else people would lease the land from the neglectful landowner and build a park. So that's kind of the neighborhood commons. And I put this lease in here, right, which is actually a proposal, right, for how this could actually just be another neighborhood commons, right? So they said, you could just do this, right? And it's perfectly respectable. It's not, anything revolutionary. Then there was the hippie, right? Hippie constituency, I would call it. So you have to imagine, right, these huge numbers of people coming in and converging in Berkeley. And what they are really trying to do is not just come together, right? And they talked about this coming together as a kind of tribal coming together, the coming together of the tribes. But they wanted to recreate themselves from the inside out. And often, they would, the idea of course, working 9 to 5 was an anathema, right, to many of them. They wanted to come together. They wanted to listen to music in parks. They wanted to participate in be-ins. They wanted to raise consciousness, right? They wanted to do all kinds of things like this. And this was an idea, of course, that was central to People's Park and to many of the organizers who were closely connected to the counterculture, to the hippies. I point out Bill Miller in particular, who was a member of the Provos, right, which was related to the Diggers in San Francisco. And he had all kinds of proposals before People's Park to tear up Telegraph Avenue, to plant grass there so that people could simply hang out, right, congregate, be themselves, occupy this space. But there was a definite constituency for remaking the city around this thing called the counterculture. I want to just point this out because I think this is an interesting document that I can't go into, unfortunately, very much. But this was one of the organizers or activists, Frank Bardacke, closely associated with the civil rights movement also and the anti-Vietnam protests. But it's the figure of Geronimo, right, with a gun. It says, "Who owns the park?" And it's tracing the illegitimate, what is called the robbery of the land back to, the Costanoan Indians, right? And suggesting that maybe there's a different relationship to people and land than what we normally conventionally think of, right, in terms of land title. And that gets me to the last piece of it, right? Radical ecology. So there was a group called Ecology Action, also, which was a splinter group of the Peace and Freedom Party. And a year before People's Park itself, they had an action which had to do with seizing a piece of land which had been slated for real estate development. Moreover, it was slated for apartments that were meant to be relatively high-priced, probably for commuters who would commute into San Francisco. It was gentrification, right? So this group wanted to connect the pollution in the Bay, gentrification, industrial civilization, right, and urban lifestyle all together in one sort of conceptual program. They took over the property. They cover over the lease sign. They rename it the Herrick Peace and Freedom Memorial Park. Herrick was a figure who had just died in an automobile accident, part of this group. They build the park, right? They record these are all their own photographs recording this. And then the city declares it an illegal park and they, they bulldoze it. So that's actually an image of that. The famous teach-in, which happened after People's Park, was called Ecology and Politics in America. And it connected explicitly, right, People's Park to radical ecology. It said they're one and the same. They're connected, right? And actually the speeches are all on the KPFA archive, so you can actually go listen to what they said. It's actually quite interesting. The the poet Gary Snyder read the Smokey the Bear Sutra, right, which was his, right, it was a quasi-Buddhist kind of mantra, right, and ends with, and fearlessly chop down the rotten trees and prune out the sick limbs of this country, America, and then burn the leftover trash, right. So this is the kind of rhetoric, right, that was being given there. I also want to point out that right after the fence went up at People's Park, a whole group of the occupiers went over to another piece of land which was slated for redevelopment that was owned by BART, the Bay Area Rapid Transit. They were in the process of building the line between the downtown Berkeley station and the North Berkeley station. To do this, they tore down a whole series of houses. That was the land to be redeveloped. So they took over a portion of this. They called it the People's Park Annex. And this became part of a whole series of sort of conversations about gentrification, ecology, right? It ends up actually in, this is a spread from the Berkeley tribe showing an alternative redevelopment, right, of this as a kind of collective space, small-scale collective space, so that one of the trajectories of People's Park, right, is the idea that it is going to be the basis for a new kind of localized, small-scale, sustainable, neighborhood-based, anarchist culture, right? And there are actually architectural drawings for how this would actually happen. So there's a lot more I could say, but including about Sim van der Rijn, another faculty member, and his involvement in this. But I'm out of time, so I'm going to end. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anthony. Okay. There you are.
All right.
Okay, welcome, Bonnie.
Thank you. This is quite fascinating. Thank you to everyone who's come before and those who will come after. This is really terrific. So I am really going to be showing some works that I've been involved in, past, present, and future. I call them life frames because it's really a way to frame life so that we can see it and experience it more profoundly. And they're very place-based. I'm very much involved in the environment because everything happens in a place, and then integrating systemically what can happen in the place so that we're creating whole experiences. So while all of these things were going on around me, I was just, I'm sure I was picking up on all of this, but I had a slightly different focus. And it had to do with transformation. It had to do with showing possibility and opportunity. So I think liberating territory is the territory of place and also the territory of our minds. And that's something that I'm involved with and have been since these early times. So this is Portable Park 1 in 1970, and actually I had an encroachment permit to do this. It won the first Sika Vernal Equinox Award from SF MoMA. So it was actually not just an ad hoc intervention, but it was a 24-hour transformation of this butt-end section of the freeway. And I kind of thought of it as a still life. There's a cow, and there I am seated there. So it was a performance installation. And then the second 24 hours was taking over 2 concrete islands next to the freeway off-ramp at Mission Van Ness. And for 24 hours, this was a more participatory environment with more cows and picnic tables, and people came and had their lunch. And this is me with the Caltrans officials next to the traffic with the young cow. And the third portable park was actually for 48 hours, and a whole street was closed off for 2 days and became a park for community. And in addition to the cows, I borrowed animals from the San Francisco Zoo. And people came and had their lunch, and it was demonstrating how relatively easily a place could be transformed. So a few months later, I came upon this area where garbage and water had collected because they were building a freeway interchange. So I saw this, and at the time I was exploring the nature of what a performance could be, where a performance could be, and who an audience could be. So I saw this place with garbage and water, and immediately went home and put on an evening gown, and then waded into the water and faced the audience, which was made up of the people who were in these slow-moving cars because of the construction of this freeway interchange. And it was a completely obviously found environment, and I sat there for a time. But what I didn't know is that I was facing what would become Crossroads Community, the farm in that building, and I was facing the northern frame of the Islayas Creek watershed. Didn't have a clue about this at the time because this all happened after the fact. The watershed is something I'm very involved in today, and have been actually ever since. And facing this freeway interchange, which I'm now proposing to become the northern gateway to the watershed. And I was actually literally sitting in water from the creek, which had come forth. So I took this idea of the seated human figure and how that could very easily transform an environment, and took it to different places. This is 20th and Mission, Church and Market, Financial District, Original Occupy, Bank of America Plaza, Golden Gate Bridge. And then I sat in various indoor-outdoor cages at the San Francisco Zoo, and then that culminated in public lunch. And I'm going very quickly because we don't really have time to go into this, but it shows an evolution of this work. And here I am at the public feeding time at 2 p.m. on a Saturday, like today, just about this time, several decades ago, having a catered lunch, a human meal, a steak, grilled steak, I might add. And in the cage with me was another cage with a rat in it. So it was a cage within a cage within a cage. Who's in the cage? And this was a public performance. People came to see the animals being fed. Well, I was one of the animals being fed. And then I did some writing as human activity, and lay down and looked up at this beautiful skylight, and it was quite fabulous. And then this tiger in the adjacent cage got up on his haunches, as you can see, and looked at me, and that's when I realized this animal is perceiving me. What is he thinking? What is he feeling? And that led me to do a lot of work with studying animal behavior and language. And then also had a lot to do with the development of Crossroads Community, the farm, which, among other things, would be a place for different species to come together with people and plants. And so this is a drawing that I made that shows this. This is the same freeway interchange. By the way, sitting still one, I was about here facing this farmhouse, what would become this farmhouse, and this interchange that, again, I'm proposing to become the northern gateway to the watershed, and the northern frame of the watershed, which is now called Cesar Chavez, then Army Street. And this became an open space piece of land where the Borden's Dairy had been raised in 1974, and this was another open space kind of parking lot, and this cluster of buildings, and then a state right-of-way, and then city land. So the idea for Crossroads Community, the farm, was literally in the crossroads of the Mission, Bernal Heights, Potrero Hill, and Bayview communities, to bring people together where the freeway had severed them, and also to bring people from different cultures together, bring different kinds of artists together. At that time, if you were a printmaker versus a painter, you know, that was a big deal, and there was a lot of prejudice among artists, if you can remember. And also to then bring people together, not only with each other, but with plants and animals. So the idea was to create this, to transform this land and integrate all of these elements. And this was the first proposal that I made, which was a drawing, collage, that showed how all of these places could be integrated. And this, there's a lot to see in this picture. It's not actually a very good photograph of it, but you get kind of the idea of simultaneous things occurring, which in fact the farm was all about. So this photograph shows a before picture where you see clearly this raised, this open space, this building disappeared, so all of a sudden it was available, and these other land fragments. So it was all about connecting fragments. And this is a side elevation drawing that I made, collage. And I thought, well, if we're going to create a park, it doesn't have to be flat. You know, it lets you recycle all of the concrete and create these rolling hillsides. So I literally went around to City Hall and the supervisors and the planning department with these drawings under my arms to show them about possibilities. And then this is the model that was made, a view north, and here's the model view south. And you'll notice all of this water, because actually the water that I was sitting in was creek water, and this site is at the convergence of 3 creeks. It's a very important place in terms of water. And so the idea then, and still is, was to use the natural water to create ponds and windmills, mitigate flooding, although the term mitigation of flooding was not something that was on the tip of my tongue. And then the city made a park, but of course they put in a fake pond right here, if you can see it, whoops, right here, not using the creek water, but using Hetch Hetchy water, which is where San Francisco gets its water. And that area, the idea for the farm was really, again, to be creating these systemically integrated participatory landscapes with activity and in the open spaces that would then help to maintain them. It would activate the places and then help to maintain them. But of course, in its wisdom at the time, with the B, D-U-M-B at the end, the city put in this fake pond and built their own building. I mean, the idea was to refurbish these buildings, integrate them into the landscape, create a contiguous whole of all of these elements, but that's not what happened. Anyway, the farm itself was a very active place, and it was at the time one of 5 alternative education places in the state of California. And the children would come as part of their school day and have experiential involvement in nature and the arts. This is an early picture of the garden on state land. This is a view from the farmhouse kitchen, and this is a very important place. We're going to see this again. This is in the center of the freeway. To me, the freeway looks Egyptian in this photograph. And this is a view from the roof. And this is the first garden on state land. And this is the same place a little bit later. And it was a very popular place for children. And this is a scarecrow that had 2 faces, 4 arms, and 3 feet. And this is a nice contrasting. I sort of thought of the farm as a diptych between the relationship of the farm as non-mechanized nature and the technological monolith of the freeway. This is the raw egg animal theater, the initial spelt treat, sort of the denouement of where the animals could come after I had done all this research, a place to learn their native intelligences and languages. And this was, again, a very popular place. This is the human theater. You mentioned Peterburg. Here's Peterburg. It's a re-inhabitory theater. This is the human theater above the raw egg animal theater. And again, the center of the freeway interchange. And I got these benches from Mexico. We had gardens in the middle of this freeway interchange. And there I am sitting on these Mexican benches. And this is a brass quintet from the San Francisco Symphony in humor of the Freeway Gardens. Instead of saying in honor of, it says in humor of. So it was the cityscapes, exhibitions, and the Freeway Gardens, and we had champagne in the middle of the freeway, this big party. And now, I left the farm at the end of 1980, and I started working on a living library. And I'm just going to give you a little taste of this because it relates to what we're talking about. But again, it's cultivating the human and ecological garden. And this is the map of the watershed. So this is the location of where the farm was. This is a nature walk that I've been developing since 2002 that's linking multiple schools and parks and public housing and streets leading down to the Islais Creek at the south side of one of the parks. This map shows the whole watershed. So a living library, which I'm, again, not going into because there's not time right at the moment, but we have all my Excelsior Living Library and Think Park is on this L-shaped piece of land, about 9 acres of 4 different schools, and this nature walk. And I'm proposing that this Cesar, now called the Cesar Chavez Freeway Interchange, and the Alemany and 101 Freeway Interchanges become the northern and southern gateways to the watershed, which you can see they really are. This blue is the water, and there are 11 communities in San Francisco that are interconnected by this watershed. And the nature walk is really a prototype of what could be happening throughout these communities. And this is the interchange next to where the farm was today, recent picture. And it's all sealed off. And it's basically a dead space. And this is the Alemany interchange. And there's a lot of flooding there because there's a lot of water there. So the point is to this story is that there's a lot of opportunity still. There's a lot of opportunity and ways to mitigate the flooding and through systemic ecological design, put together a lot of pieces of the puzzle. And a living library, which is this framework that I've developed since I left the farm, which really, and the initials are all, links local resources, human, ecological, economic, historic, technological, and aesthetic, seen through the lens of time, past, present, and future. So there's a lot more to say, but this is another place of territory.
Yes, I can see that there's also going to be microphones in the audience. Let me just begin with two questions myself. And I guess the first most directly comes out of your talk, Lisa, but anybody can chime in. And the second is going to come most directly out of your talk, but has real resonance, I think, and again, anyone can chime in. You began, I think, with a really provocative insight about the almost monthly commemorations that we're experiencing now in relationship to the heart of the 60s, the radical 60s, right? I mean, every, from 2014 and et cetera, as we move through this decade. And so in relation to the Panthers, I think your observation that there is, in how you experience those commemorations, a kind of deterritorialization, a taking out of territory from remembrance of that politics, I think is worth discussion and meditation. So my question is, how do you understand that kind of politics of memory, right? How do you understand some of the conditions that have transpired since that time that make it so that 50 years later, and there seems to be a sort of absence of that dimension of the political memory, or am I mischaracterizing the broader moment too for Black liberation struggles at large, et cetera? So that's a way of opening to maybe thinking about where do you see the re-territorialization of that struggle happening?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think I would start by saying that my read of the commemorative practices that have been taking place, particularly with the Panthers, is a generous one. It's the one I need right now. And it kind of gets us into conversations about history and then how we go about accessing and re-narrating that history. So historiography in a word, right? And so for all my observations about the non-site specificity of the Panthers and how they're being commemorated in Oakland, there were other examples that suggest otherwise. Like, for example, I think the OMCA's, one of their marketing slogans was, "See where it all happened," or "Oakland is where it happened." Maybe some of you saw the show and were attuned to that. And so there was a localism going on at the same time as a kind of globalism or a deterritorialization. So there's that point to sort of observe. But that sort of puts it back in the interpreters or the historians or the activists' hands, right? Like, what kind of history do we need? And how do we tell that history? And so this is something I'm, you know, especially since this whole panel is framed about legacies, inheritances, and use value of history, is something I'm thinking about a lot. And I'm not really sure. I mean, I think there's, for all the value of a deterritorialized account of Panther history, you know, what is it possible to go transnational and also stay attuned to the physical spaces and the material conditions of place that are constitutive of any Black life in the United States right now, right? So, so I'm thinking about that, those tensions, but I'm also thinking about the ways in which, let's say, BLM, the Movement for Black Lives, has exploded as a networked digital movement that is incredibly deterritorialized, decentralized, online, and a kind of perfect exemplar of activism in the age of digital reproduction, to paraphrase someone like Walter Benjamin, who thought a lot about the value and the radical possibility of reproduction, and which is another way of saying getting out of place and moving across time and space. So there's that also to observe. So those are just two initial thoughts about that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, I guess it goes without saying that part of the history that falls between the 60s and now, and that no doubt shapes the ways we relate to that history, but also how we relate to our own political imagination and possibilities now, is neoliberalism. And what work that has done as a political and economic project on our own imaginaries. And so that's a way of leading to this other question, that I just want to say personally, it was really beautiful to see that history, and to you know, just to be present with someone who is you know, unwaveringly just hungry and experimenting now, you know, and again, across like my whole time being on the planet, you know. So that's really that's the best, right? So now the tension of, I mean, I think that I could speak for everyone in a way that, like, we know that the kinds of interventions you've been a part of, there's a certain ubiquity to them now. There's like, they've been profoundly influential on lots of people's, you know, small scale projects to remake place. And part of the rub, and I'm not trying to invoke a kind of purity politics here, but part of the rub is like how those experiments and those practices have figured into gentrification and have been celebrated, and a kind of sexy and frontline approach of capital to draw more people in to the businesses in this area, and you know where I'm getting at.
It's a conundrum.
Please speak to that conundrum a bit, and how, I mean, where, how have you wrestled with it?
It's a conundrum because there's something about, it's called human evolution. It's human beings and what we do. And artists have always been in advance of the economic development of an area. That's nothing new. And ideas and transformation is evolutionary. And so there's an ecosystem to development, in a way, a process that occurs. And I mean, I don't have the answer to this, but you want to improve places because it improves the quality of life, and we want to improve the quality of life. So I think that there's also a conundrum with, I think the problem with gentrification is that it pushes people out. It pushes the low-income people out. So I think the trick would be to find a way to improve the quality of life and keep for people, for the gente, to be there. I mean, we want to be educated. We want to have beautiful clothes. We want to live in healthy, beautiful places with trees and flowers and vegetables. But we don't want to be displaced. So displacement is the issue that we're talking about as a result of gentrification, I think. And so that has to do with the whole economic system, and the way the government sets it up in this culture, this kind of Western culture.
Thanks. And one last comment and question for Anthony that as we transition and open it up. Anthony, in your study of the communities around the People's Park, reclaiming and the Berkeley Liberation Program that had relationship to that, et cetera. I mean, how did you find them grappling with some of these tensions? They weren't naive to it. It's really quite profound, I think, in my experience looking back, that about what they saw at stake.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, I was interested to see how much they were dealing with problems of gentrification in that period. We tend to think of it as something that comes along later in the 70s. But they had a profoundly anarchist viewpoint in terms of governance, and I think that's important to say, right? Because what we see in the, after the 30s, right, the decline of the New Deal, right? New Deal all being about massive government support, but in this very sort of organized, massive way, right? Dams, large projects. And there was, I think, among this group, a lot of suspicion of that kind of infrastructure, that kind of mass bureaucracy, all of this kind of thing, and in favor of something that they felt was, first of all, more authentic in terms of human beings, human interaction, but also in terms of being sensitive to local ecology, right, to the planet, that kind of thing, but also in an economic sense that they wanted to bring these together, right? So there was an emphasis on these tiny institutions. So one thing that you see in Berkeley in this period is called something called the food conspiracies, which were kind of like co-ops, and they would exchange food from small farms and gardens, and they would basically they were trying to create a separate economy, and you can actually see this coming out of the diggers and out of the provos a little bit, who had their own sort of separate economy that they were building, separate little institutions. And I think, and they were also involved in fighting landlords. I mean, there's a lot of political work that was happening on an economic level as well. I mean, I think it's difficult to say because it has there's a tricky legacy there, right? Because if you, on the one hand, you can create these socialist institutions on a micro scale, but if you ignore the macro scale of, nation states and corporations and all of this, it's very easy for these to get pushed aside, right? And if you don't have ownership of the land, or you don't pay your taxes, right? So you have to pay attention to all of these scales of power and of, and I think that's where maybe some of the naivete came in, that they thought they could just be in these communes, in these small spaces, and create these networks. And I should think not just small, I mean, they were networks that went across the country. So I don't know if that answers your question, but.
All right, please. We have a half hour before we have to clear out and liberate this territory to the film screening, but let's continue the dialogue. There's mics on both sides, and okay.
I wonder if any of you could shed some light on the Coevolution Quarterly that was given over to the Black Panthers, and this seems like a very interesting moment of intersection, maybe between the ecology movement, although I don't know if coevolution was really that focused on ecology. But anyway, how that happened and what happened when it happened. Was it a smooth thing? Was it what? It's so interesting to me.
I'll give it a shot. I don't know the specific circumstances that made it possible for the BPP to do that guest edited issue in 1974. I think it was September of 1974. But it was part of, I've encountered this history twice, once at the OMCA in their retrospective, and once in the Hippie Modernism catalog, an essay by Simon Sadler, who talks about the coevolution BPP issue as a kind of moment of intersection between two kinds of modernisms, the mandala and the raised fist, to dichotomize it in his terms. And for those of you who don't know, the Coevolution Quarterly was the sort of supplement of the Whole Earth catalog, which was edited by Stuart Brand, and so it represents a very particular genealogy of countercultural Bay Area hippie modernism. But how it is that the BPP ended up editing it is not the specific circumstances isn't clear to me. But what I think it's interesting about that particular moment was that it is a kind of indication that there are moments of overlap and intersection, not moments of well, I don't know how else to characterize the relationship. So, but when you look at the Berkeley barb or the tribe, you also see moments of intersection and allyship in today's vocabulary, right? You see Eldridge Cleaver's writing in the tribe and the barb. You see cover images or covers devoted to Panther activism. You see schedules of teach-outs that are going on in West Oakland. You see a lot of interaction. You see less of it in the Black Panther newspaper. You see some references to the white counterculture and the hippies. You see some animosity in some of the writing and some sense of for all my discussion of deterritorialization, a sense of anxiety about the security of the panthers as they move up the street or the region. So it was I would hesitate to make this sort of a firm thesis, but one could say that it was a kind of a uneven or asymmetrical interaction insofar as it's the Berkeley folks who are reaching out and over, and it's less the other way. I don't know if that begins to answer your question, but yeah.
Getting back to People's Park, I'd like to point out that when it first was liberated and the housing was torn down, it was a true form of liberation because the university was in the business of building concrete bunkers everywhere, and then when they had to expand, they took over the Clark Kerr campus and drove out the School of the Deaf down to a cabbage patch in Fremont. And there is another place that they could expand some kind of development. And then they built the huge athletic thing where they have all their big games up there in the hills where it's right on the fault. I don't think the institution is very clear on where this is and what the issues are around here. I chaired the Parks Commission in Berkeley for 12 years, and we opened the first urban creek in the United States. Strawberry Creek was opened way back then, and as I speak, we're opening another one in West Berkeley in a very low-income area. These places are so important, and the university persists in ignoring it. I've worked on the People's Park thing for years and brought in the Trust for Public Land, who said they would be happy to take over some of the responsibilities for the park, and the university said, oh no, we're not going to give up an inch. And meanwhile, they wanted the city of Berkeley to pay to have the park maintained. And the university, all throughout the university campus, I know a lot of the people that work in the maintenance, they are not treated very well. They're not protected from these pesticides and other bad things that they have to do by the university. They just are there to do whatever they're told to do without complaining. And the fact that the university thinks they have to do something now with People's Park is crazy. The city of Berkeley has been paying some amount every year to have the park maintained. The park, we tried to open Derby Creek on the south side of the park. It's very wet there, and it continues to be wet. And when the university put in some housing further down on Dwight, they told me that they couldn't put in underground parking because of the creek. So it's a disadvantage to whatever they're trying to do. And they're covert. They do not really let people know what all the issues are, and never have, never will. And it's really, of course, the students don't count. in the equation. Their well-being is not a very big issue, but they're very interested in developing more housing for whom? The students who may or may not be able to afford or to want to live here. And I think the whole idea of they're doing what they're trying to do to the park is very distressing.
Thank you.
Can I just point?
Yeah, please.
The Chronicle, I think the headline is People's Park Tale Turns Towards Housing Again. So if anyone has not seen that, that's
I saw it,
Sunday's.
and
Yeah. So, yeah.
housing, but not the kind of housing anybody would want. All the housing they've built so far is really not good.
Well, let me just say, I mean, I think two interesting points. One is that this is an ongoing history, right? The history is not put to rest, and a lot of the issues are ongoing. And also one thing that was really a point of contention at the teach-in on ecology and politics was this attempt by the university to separate people out, say our campus, our territory is for students, faculty, and staff, right? Everyone else, are basically sort of enemies, or they're, potential enemies, or something like this. And the thrust of that teach-in was like, no, that's absurd. First of all, this is a public university, right? They're, they're benefiting everybody, or they should benefit everybody. That they're part of the city of Berkeley. They're being hosted by the city of Berkeley, right? So on and on to this sense of land as something which is beyond simply land title to, the things like the watersheds. So I mean, it's very interesting that it was exactly that sense of division, right, and bureaucratic division and dividing people up, spatially, that was a point of debate back in '69.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that there is a kind of an atrophy, a weakening of the strengths of affiliation across campus and community in decades since, and that a kind of, as I hear and understand it, a sort of porousness that defined the university as commons. And I mean, that was never, I don't mean to suggest it in like some complete and romantic way, but that, that has suffered in decades since. And the implications of that, of how different something like Eshelman, which is, kind of the student space, like how that building has changed over time. It used to be, as I understand it, much more of a kind of community and student space, and people moved in and out, and that is, now, I mean, I work here, I can barely get upstairs, So part of what I hear in your comments and think we should all hold on to is this sense of like, okay, the signs are building that another struggle is going to go down around this space. Well, what resources sort of communally, relationally, imaginatively, politically, visionarily do we have and bring to bear at this perspective moment, and exactly why I think it's important that we're having these historical conversations, etc. A question up there.
I had a whoa, I'm pretty loud. I don't think do I need the mic? Okay.
Thanks.
Hello. I had a question about kind of in the lecture about the Black Panther Party and how they, I guess for lack of a better word, psychically or mentally colonized space and territory for themselves. The focus of that lecture was more on kind of how they were able to create a sort of mental territory. And I thought it was kind of interesting that there was not a lot of discussion about kind of where the Panthers actually were inhabiting spatially, as opposed to conversations about People's Park seem to focus in the exact opposite way about how things are taking up physical space and how there are mental repercussions. But I guess the question that I have is, do you feel like it is possible to talk about the Panther Party in spatial terms that are physical, not just mental, being that they were so heavily subjugated not only by local and federal government, but also just by kind of the constraints of their operation? Do you think that they were more successful at a kind of mental territory takeover than a physical one?
That's a great question, thank you. The answer is yes. And it's not only possible, it's necessary to attend to the physical spatialization of the Panthers in Oakland, of Oakland, as much as these mental moves to get out of Oakland through these various procedures that I'm attempting to track. So, and you know, that's work that's you know, yet to be done. But I think it involves paying attention to, for example, where the headquarters were, where they've changed, where, well, you know, there's a walking tour that you can take. I don't know if it's still available or whether you've done it. I think the company was Detour that did a sort of a spatial recap of the Black Panthers in West Oakland. And what's so fascinating about that one example is that you start at the grade school that Huey Newton went to, and then you walk towards the house that he grew up in. You walk towards a very contested intersection, i.e. where there was a run-in with the police. Then you walk down, but so there's a kind of retelling of spatial histories there. But as you're doing this, you're also getting narration. It's a immersive audio walking tour that uses GPS systems. So already we don't get our space in the conventional way that we might think of a kind of secure, materially integrity kind of thing. But so this walking tour takes you down the street, and then your soundtrack moves from the Lumpen, which was the Panthers band, to more contemporary hip hop, to accounts of some neighbors in West Oakland who are doing community garden projects, to the, not the living library, but the little free library that you can open and grab a copy of Mao's Little Red Book, read it, or you're prompted to read it at certain moments. When I opened the door, it was gone. And then think about Subarus, and count the Subarus in your neighborhood as some kind of index of the rising housing costs in West Oakland, right? So this was someone's quote, and I can't remember who it was. It might have been Emory Douglas who said, I'm not sure, but you know, to get a sense of housing costs, just count the Subarus. That was some kind of index for gentrification. So even that one specific example of returning to space or thinking about space complicates the very idea of a kind of spatialized account. That said, I still, you know, knowing where the survival programs unfolded, knowing where the Oakland Community School was located in the city, where was the boycott against the liquor store, like that kind of that mapping is important too, and it's work that I'm interested in doing as part of, not as a kind of answer to another kind of mapping of Panther Oakland. Yeah. Yeah.
So would you consider then the spaces where the Panthers resided as liberated territory in the same way that People's Park is liberated territory, or are they two distinct types of liberation, or does one of them not even count?
Well, so there's residential spaces, and then there's public spaces that define Panther activism and the Black experience in Oakland in the late '60s, right? So there's houses, there's apartment buildings, there's DeFremery Park, which was renamed Little Bobby Hutton Park after his assassination. There's ways of, and then in addition to those spaces, there's ways in which those spaces were both sites of enfranchisement and disenfranchisement, sites of seizure and sites of displacement. So it's, again, I don't mean to be like academic about it and keep complicating the story, but every time I try to like find like something kind of authentic or something that to hold on to in this history, it slips away from me because the very idea of something stable is complicated when you look at the politics of space, right? And the ways in which space is produced through social relations as much as the physical thing, yeah? So.
Peter.
Well, it's interesting to mention, I was around at the time, and there was a big People's Park march, a huge march, with many of us on the faculty, and I was one of the few, being the director of this museum at the time, I was one of the administrators on this march. A few weeks after that, there was a regents meeting on campus, and Norton Salmon, one of the illustrious regents, asked me to visit with him, and he wanted to show me a picture, an image of a picture, whether he should buy it or not for his superb collection. So we met for coffee, and I said, I'm really not so much interested in this picture because we just had a meeting of the regents in which People's Park was discussed, and whether People's Park should be turned over to the city, which was very much of a possibility at the time. And I would much rather talk about People's Park. And then Norton Salmon said, well, I don't know. And I said, look, a man was killed by the Reagan National Guard, and another man was blinded because of People's Park. And you talked to me about something that's quite irrelevant. And we had a big argument at that point between the big regent and me. And it was really left nowhere. But I told him, and he said, but we cannot, he said, in that People's Park march, he had pictures that you were on, we saw a photograph of a half-nude girl on a truck. We can't allow this. And I said, Mr. Salmon, I'm talking to you about a man being killed, and you talk to me about this girl on the truck. I don't think we can communicate. And that was sort of the last communication I had with Regent Salmon. Thank you.
Wow. Thanks for having that argument. So maybe we're running out of time. Maybe should we do just some short closing reflections or one last question? What do you all feel? So think about some closing thoughts. Sure.
Just want to mention, I think it was last night, I'm losing track of time, there was the great Bobby Seale documentary here in the theater Stagger Lee, and he was talking about, it was an interview done with him in prison, and he was talking to the interviewer about his experience in the Hole, which was a 5 by 7 foot cell, and he was talking about that space as a liberated territory, and about how it was a space that he came to realize was only fearful to the guards, that the guards had made it in the image of their own fear, and as a revolutionary he didn't have to fear it, and so he could occupy that space in a revolutionary way without fear and really screw with the guards' minds. So I thought that was an example of a Black Panther liberated space.
Well, my closing thought's this, and then invite anyone else to chime in. It's twofold. The first is that in this moment, this Trump moment, it's clear that municipalities, that localities immediately are stepping up to resist this agenda, and we need to, I think we really need to embrace that, and I have been quite surprised about that, the immediate reactions of city councils and district attorneys around the country. I've felt it as a point of pride in an otherwise, quite, dark and terrorizing atmosphere. And I want us to go further, of course. And secondly, the paradox of this moment of such digital interconnection against what I experience in terms of living a life largely, with students and in these university spaces of really of severe kinds of segregation and disconnection. And I feel, as I do my own explorations of these earlier times, and many times today was invoked important sort of solidarities and interconnection, no doubt complicated and full of messiness, but nonetheless, I'm just saying we really need to go into that messiness, and we really need to experiment and challenge our own norms and practices to deepen intercommunality, to invoke, the Panthers.
Well, I think the fact that we're in this moment of such public negativity, that it actually has, as you have said, created the opposite effect. It's really brought people together. And I feel that in the work that I'm doing, which is really about educating people and demonstrating interconnected systems and interconnected cultures, that it's really a planetary genre, and it's meant to be in different places. I want to do this work in places where it's really needed, to find the commonalities between all of us. And I think it's doable. And you're right, we do have to act locally. And it's sort of ironic, but with Trumpism, they're giving states and local governments a lot of, they're giving control back to the local place. So that's an opening to really be active in a positive way. I don't think we have to be negative about it, but I think there's a lot we can be positive about in the face of reality.
Yeah, I want to second these comments, and also the idea of governance, I think, became increasingly apparent to people in the counterculture who were initially, they were the sort of theatrically attempting to tear down barriers, and they were almost like performance artists in some level. And towards the end of the 60s and into the 70s, they really become much more involved in municipal politics and in things that we normally associate maybe with the New Left or that kind of thing, and trying to combine these together to really understand that to have an agenda for change, for changing space, for liberating territory, you actually have to understand how power works and how politics works. And I would say at the local level, but also probably at a larger level, right? I think municipalities need to think about international relations, probably, and be in connection with places in Mexico and Canada and Europe and elsewhere. And this is actually kind of fits in with a lot of the ideas then about space, which I think was complicated, right? Because there is physical territory, which is important, and you can't just sort of ignore, what is happening on this plot of land. But also the idea that, of course, it's part of a larger ecological system, other network systems that run through it, that it's as much a process which occurs in space as a particular space itself. So I guess that would be my comment.
Well, those are all excellent comments. I'm not sure if I have anything to add except my refrain, which is, I guess, speaks to process and messiness and optimism. And that is, if we're really going to get into it, we need to talk about liberated territories along the question of the human and the non-human, and the extent to which liberation is contingent upon that category of the human, right? Liberation for whom and for what? Human for whom and for what is sort of the way I think about it. And one of the things I think is so interesting about radical geographies as a sort of question is that it upends and lays bare some of the histories of being non-human in the US and globally, right? And so we need to think about bureaucracy, we need to think about the messiness, and we need to think about, once again, what it means to not be human. Because that's a very messy question. It's messier than Shepard Fairey's poster, and it's clean circulation online and in protest spaces, physical and otherwise. Right? It's a problem that has yet to be even articulated in the right way. And I think part of things like this counterculture history is an opportunity to revisit the very sort of fluid identities, but also historical habits of non-humanizing humans, humanizing non-humans, and thinking about that as the terrain and the question of liberation as much as, and in addition to physical spaces, governance, the value of art, and so forth. So,
Peter Berg, Digger, his quote, "Create the conditions you describe." Huey Newton, all power to the people. Thanks for the afternoon, and enjoy the museum, and let's take the conversation to the lobby. We got to clear the space, huh? Thanks, Greg, Sherry, everybody else. We'll be out in the lobby.
Oh, no problem.